Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lynn Kronberger, the Chief Development Officer here at WAMU. As a public media organization, our mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and around the world. Public radio works because listeners and members who value the service step up and give back. Support from listeners and members is also our most reliable and most important source of funding, especially right now. This book club would not be possible if we did not have your support. So if you are enjoying these monthly virtual book clubs, please consider making a gift. You can give at www.dianerehm.org/give. We are grateful for the over 680 people who have registered to join us today. Just so you know, this event is being recorded and streamed on Facebook. Closed caption is available. Just click the button on your screen. And now let us start the discussion with the host of our book club, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lynn, and welcome to all of you to the October meeting of my virtual book club. Today we'll discuss The Beekeeper of Aleppo by British author Christy Lefteri. It's the story of a couple fleeing the war in Syria and seeking asylum in England. The novel has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide and won the Aspen Institute's 2020 Literary Prize for, quote, an influential work of fiction that illuminates a vital contemporary issue. Joining me today, Zaina Erhaim, a Syrian journalist who covered the war and now works as an independent media and communications consultant. Omar El Akkad, a former journalist and author of the novels American War and What a Strange Paradise, and Bethanne Patrick, a writer and book critic who tweets at the Book Maven and serves on the board of the Faulkner Foundation. Throughout the hour, we'll take your questions. You can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And now to welcome all of you, I hope you all enjoy this discussion. And welcome, Bethanne, Omar, and Zaina. I'm so glad to have you with me. One other creature is with us, and that is my little dog, Bella. She has appeared on just about all of our book clubs. She is a little Havanese poodle. She's 3 years old, and she enjoys all the discussions.
Greetings, Bella.
Thank you. Bethanne.
And Diane.
Thank you. Bethanne, actually, I'm going to start with you because in the first few pages of the book, we learn so much about Nuri, the narrator, Afra, his wife, and Sammy. Tell us about these characters and how their lives unfold.
Well, Nuri, Afra, and Sammy are a family, and that's the first and most important thing I believe to know about them. And we're going to see different layers of their lives as the book unfolds, as the story unfolds. But at first, they are a husband, a wife, and a son, and they have a life in Syria. It may not be the life of, the privileged, it may not be an upper class life, but it is a life of Nouri as a beekeeper with his cousin Mohammed, and Afra as a homemaker bringing up their son. And she's also a very, very gifted painter. Who has an active artistic life. And that is something, unfortunately, I don't think we get to see enough of in the book, but they each are so happy as people who are craft people, but also love and have a passion for what they do. And when we meet them, we know already that they have had some slings and arrows in their lives and are now refugees. And we also know that Sammy is no longer with us.
Indeed, Omar, we know that Sammy, their 7-year-old son, has been killed by a bomb
Yes.
that landed actually in their front yard. But the other thing we learn is that Nouri became a beekeeper against his father's wishes. How does that affect Nouri and his attitude toward the bees and toward his own family?
I mean, the bees are doing a lot of heavy metaphorical lifting in this novel. They have a lot of work to do. I think one of the things that struck me about this book, I recently was reading this nonfiction book by Evan Osnos called Wildland, which is basically just a compendium of all the different ways in which America is struggling right now. And there's a scene in that book where he's in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is the hedge fund capital of America. It's where all these incredibly rich people go. And he's at a charity dinner where they're raising $1 million and they're all very pleased with themselves. And somebody he's talking to says, these people, they love charity, but they're very uncomfortable with justice, because charity they can do, but justice requires them to take a side. And I think one of my favorite, there's a lot of things that I think the book, I don't want to criticize a book that sold more copies than I ever will sell in many, many lifetimes, but there's lots of places where the book doesn't do it for me. One of the places it does, I think, is in Nouri's relationship with himself. So you have this person who is in this profession, and obviously there's a jarring disconnect between what you're expected to be and what you are. But then that carries through to an almost sort of extreme degree with the plight that he faces throughout the course of the book, and the ways in which that causes him to fall apart, I thought was probably my favorite thing about this book. And if anything, I wish the author had been less overt about it, because when it first shows up, when these first slivers of something's not right, something, there's a tree with keys hanging off of it, something's not right, those first slivers to me were some of the most fascinating in the book. And I think there's certain boxes in which characters in these kinds of stories, particularly to a Western audience, are put, which is the eternally grateful migrant. You have to fit a certain personality type. And I think he was breaking down outside of those boxes. And that was, I think, my favorite thing about the book and the way it was structured.
Zaina, one of the things that Bethanne mentioned is that Afra is, as we learn early on, a very talented painter, but she has lost her sight. She can no longer see. So her husband, Nouri, must do everything, especially after Sammy dies. She is so stunned. She is so shocked. She can no longer do anything for herself. Tell me your impressions of Afra.
Speaking from a different perspective as a Syrian journalist who doesn't know or write or planning to write any novels, I think it strikes me because such men are pretty rare, because all those who I know of would get married a week after their wives got like permanently ill, or they're going to be pressured to do that. And I think the lack of family is also one of the elements that I didn't understand. We don't live in small families where we are. We're always surrounded by tens of members of our family. So
Yeah.
taking any decision by you and your wife and the son, that was like an extreme, unrealistic, fictional event for me. So I was wondering all the time, why didn't his mom take care for her? Why did her family come? Why they took the decision on their own? And I know those people who were left at the end into those areas, they didn't have any chance to go to regime-held areas or to escape. So being completely separated, and this particular zoom in didn't seem well connected for me. And I think the kind of personality created for Afra made me a bit angry, because it kind of eventually stereotyped what our women are. They're blind, they don't speak, they don't get angry, they don't have anything to do, they're pretty much passive, and eventually they got re-victimized again. So I wasn't able to connect. I was angry from Afra's character. And I think the only connection I was able to make with Nouri as a refugee, when he went to Croydon to do his interview, because that was the only minute where I was in his shoes and I felt it. But the Syria part, I wasn't able to feel for it.
And you know, in a sense, Nouri becomes angry with Afra, even no matter how much he loves and adores her, especially at the beginning when they were a family with Sammy. He begins to really almost think about killing her at one moment, so she will not suffer any longer. But it is that moment when the hives, and there are hundreds of beehives that he and his cousin Mohammed share, the beehives are deliberately burned. That was, for him, the beginning of the end, Omar, of his time in Aleppo.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me. Everything Zaina just said is really fascinating to me, because I mean, by virtue of what I sort of do for a living, I look at all of these things in terms of craft, right? And that's a slightly different perspective, but it does seem like I often equate it to a map making effort, and you can usually tell when the map maker has studied the land by walking over, has studied it by foot, or if they've sort of flown over it, or if they're looking at Google satellite imagery. And I think you've got sort of all three of those happening in this book. So particularly the parts that are happening in Syria, and the parts that describe the sort of the background, the setup for the journey we're about to go back and forth from for the rest of the book. There's a bit of distance there, and it feels like there's a bit of distance between the author and the material, which I'm not, that's fine one way or the other. But then you get to the refugee camps, and it becomes a little clearer that the distance is closing in. This author now has a more central experience with what's going on. And then you get to what, again, I mean, Zaina mentioned the parts about applying for refugee status. I mean, the parts that are happening in England, then that distance closes in quite a bit. One of my favorite scenes in the book was the conversation that the family is having with this. She's trying not to be cold, but this fairly cold sort of official who's putting the bureaucracy ahead of their well-being, and it happens a number of times. I mean, sorry you didn't have your address on the form, go back and get me another one, is a pretty, I think anyone who's been through the sort of migrant conveyor belt has dealt with their version of that. So yeah. I think it was fascinating to me, because I go back to the beekeeper sort of, that part, and it's a stunning scene. I mean, it's a very stunning scene when that is destroyed. but there's also a bit of distance. There's also a sense that this is being described to me from a little further away than the
Well,
stuff that's happening at the detention camp and in England.
If I may jump in on things that both Zaina and Omar have just said, what Zaina says about Afra is so spot on. It's so frustrating to see a woman in such a passive role. And it's also frustrating to see this distance, as Omar said, between the author and some of the material. I felt that Lefteri was trying to have Nuri be someone whose trauma was internal versus Afra, whose trauma was more obvious and external. I don't know, because of the things you've both said, if that was successful. And I think she was trying to find a way to bring this couple in all these different places with, Nuri not recognizing his deep PTSD and, thinking that he's seeing everything for Afra, but really there are so many things he's seeing incorrectly or not seeing at all. So it's a really interesting, these are all problems we're talking about, but they also bring us deeper into the problem of being a refugee. And that's what I found fascinating.
As did I. And please, I must correct myself. Earlier, I called his cousin Muhammad when, in fact, his cousin's name is Mustafa. The young Muhammad comes in much later in the novel as something of a ghostly figure, which we find out toward the end. A question came in: what was the significance of bouncing back and forth between Athens and London? Omar?
I mean, again, I look at these things from the perspective of just craft. And my suspicion is that the author has to deal with a certain degree of difficulty in describing an experience that, this is a huge overgeneralization on my part, but it tends to involve moments of absolute chaos and fear and terror, but also these huge swaths of monotony and kind of nothing happening and nothing happening, and you're waiting and you're waiting. And so my suspicion is that by going back and forth, in addition to being able to create sort of mini cliffhangers all the way along, which you get right from the beginning of this murder that's talked about. And then for, 100-page stretch, we're kind of left just thinking about it. So you're able to do that, but you're also able to, I think, balance out the moments of extreme chaos and fear and terror with these necessarily very boring experiences that you're having when you're waiting to essentially be deemed human enough for safety. So
Exactly.
I think that's probably why we're going back and forth, but obviously the author would know better than I.
Zaina, I must say, I was interested in learning that Christy Lefteri needed to turn to a number of people who had firsthand experience in Aleppo to fill out the gaps that she, geographic or otherwise, the shape and style of the camps, for example, the way people were treated. She did turn to people who had firsthand knowledge of the geography and how Nuri and Afra would have had to make their escape. I thought that was very revelatory, especially to your point.
Yeah, to be frank, I was reading the first parts pretty quickly, because even the parts where the names or the food names that they were mentioned, I felt that they were mentioned to prove that the writer is relevant to the story, and she is not. So I felt there is a kind of exaggeration. Some of the towns that she mentioned, like I pass by every day, I wouldn't even like look at them. So being mentioned in purpose in such a context, I felt it's trying to prove that I am relevant to this place, which is not the case. And as a journalist myself, I also have an issue about relying on fixers or firsthand information without making their voices and names heard in the stories. I think after 10 years or whatever, we're still discussing whether people should be voicing themselves or being represented and speaking on behalf of themselves or being quoted by others. This is one of my main issues with any novels and any films that are being made about us, the third world, without us speaking on our behalf. I wanted to hear Nouri or whoever's voice, but I wasn't. I was hearing him being echoed by eventually a white person who is Western, who just went to the camp for 3 months and searched for the story and was able to write it.
Of course, she was born in Cyprus. Lefteri was born in Cyprus, and I think through her fiction showed us a part of the refugee experience that we have not had. I mean, we've seen photographs in the newspapers of what happens to refugees. We've seen the deaths. We've seen the lack of food, the starvation, the killing. But in her fictional telling, I understand that you as a journalist, Zaina, would say, well, this is not really how it happened, but perhaps as a fiction writer, Bethanne, she is allowed to take some liberties.
This is a big question. I know Omar will have thoughts on it as well. And what I want to say is a couple of things. First, to Zaina's point, I was talking about this the other day, the Own Voices movement, hashtag Own Voices, because everything's hashtagged, right? Is not about saying, only Syrians can write about Syria. That's not what Zaina's saying, I know. It's saying, take away the gaze, take away the Western white gaze. And I don't think in The Beekeeper of Aleppo, we are without that gaze. I mean, would you agree, Zaina? That's part of the problem, is that we, continue to see that Western lens. And, or would you disagree?
Yeah, I was able to see it, especially in the latest parts when she speaks about the crime. It was too obvious for me.
It was too obvious. But then the other thing I also want to say is, well, three things. The second thing is, I do think Christy, as Diane, you've said, is illuminating something for us, and she was trying. But the third thing, and I'll be very quick, and then I hope Omar will join in this discussion on this question. There are so many amazing authors around the globe who are writing from their own experience, their own country, their own culture. And sometimes, and I know Lefteri is Cypriot, I know that she is attempting to give us a view of something we don't often see, but I wish we Americans would look closer and find the novelists writing in the Arab world, the novelists who are writing about their own experiences in refugee camps, who might be from other cultures as well. And I really believe in work in translation, in books in translation, and I'd love to see something from a Syrian refugee about their experience going through this.
So a few years ago, I wrote this book called American War, and there's a scene, it's the most graphic scene in the book. It's a massacre that takes place at a camp, and it's very much based on a massacre that actually happened in a place called Sabra and Shatia. Sabra and Shatia was a refugee camp for Palestinians. It was the site of a horrible massacre about 40 years ago. And when I would do events in North America, when I would talk to readers, one of the points that came up over and over and over again was, why did you have to make it so brutal? Why is it so graphic? So on and so forth. And that's fine. That's a way of reading it. And then I was doing a book club, an Egyptian book club. I was doing a virtual event with an Egyptian book club who saw, camp patience is sabr in Arabic, sabra and shatiya. They made the connection right away. And the first question was, if this is based on sabra and shatiya, why did you tone it down so much? And so I don't disagree with anything you said about this novel providing us with a perspective and illuminating. I just think the word us is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, right? And so I don't fault the author for writing this book. I don't even think it's a bad book or anything. I think that it's a similar situation with something like all of those military veterans who came back from Iraq and wrote novels about how horrible it was and how sad it made them. And some of them were very good novels. Also, there's a million dead Iraqis who don't get a chance to write those kinds of books now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that I'm going to dump on any individual author. That is a systemic issue with publishing in the Western world. At the very least, I think something like only 3% of novels not written in English end up getting translated into English. Whereas it headed in the other direction, that number is much, much bigger. So you're coming up against a systemic issue that is silencing the voices that should be heard from more than any others. That is not the fault of this particular author, but it is a privilege that author carries with them as being part of the in-group that can write about this. And I think that's something that's worth acknowledging. I don't think it's the fault of the author. I think it's something that needs to be acknowledged.
Here is a comment from one of our viewers who says, I felt Afra really was depicted as the stronger character. Yes, she was silent and blinded for a time as she dealt with the shock of her son's death, but she recognized that Nuri was falling apart, and she loved him back from the brink. That seemed a very positive depiction of woman. Zaina, do you have a comment?
Yeah, if I'm going to jump back to the latest chapters, I think for her to be in this passiveness when such a thing is happening to her, and then the way that she even tell it to Nuri, and I was like, you don't want to know, and it's kind of sacrifice that she made for them to go away to refugee. I didn't feel, but that's, I didn't understand her because she wasn't speaking, and as all stereotypical women, she is the one who express, or you can see the trauma on her, unlike men who can handle it better and just keep it for themselves. Yeah, maybe I didn't realize that this internal and external trauma, but for me, I didn't see her anger. I didn't see her frustration. I didn't hear her shouting when such a thing happened. And I think for me, I felt awful because I felt she was suppressed again. And I really felt angry for her at the end. And I wished I didn't finish the book to that extent.
Really? Really?
Yeah.
Why do you suppose that this book has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide, when in fact here we are hearing pretty much criticism of the writer? What do you think, Bethanne?
I definitely think that this is a book that plays on readers' emotions, and that's okay. There are lots of books that play on readers' emotions. The problem is when you get to someone's heartstrings and you're kind of overlooking a big truth. And the big truth is what Omar said, the problem of us, that this book, here we have a book that plays on our heartstrings. Who is the our in that sentence? Who is the us? And I do think it sold so many copies because we in the Western world, we in the United States, in fact, this is even in the book. I think at one point, someone says, "Oh, you English, you've never experienced war on your own turf." And I thought, well, talk to someone who was in the Blitz about that. So I almost thought, there were things that Lefteri hadn't thought through. Clearly, we're all talking about them, but there are also some really beautiful things in this book about grief, about friendship, about getting people through, and those are tangled up with some of these more problematic things. But I think that some of the, and I'm not saying she gets every emotion right. I wouldn't want to make that big a statement, but especially some of the grief that I see Nuri going through in his trauma, with his PTSD. I thought, I know a lot of people who have gone through that, not just because of war, also because of familial trauma, also because of moving, all kinds of things.
So here is an audience question. Nuri's comment about Afra. He says, "I'm glad she is blind because she wouldn't see the horrors of the camps. But then she begins to see colors and shapes at the end of the book. So there is an element of hope. We are like Afra. How many Americans really see or care about the plight of Syrian refugees in Turkey, Jordan, etc.? Is Lefteri's goal to awaken her readers?" Omar.
I mean, if I had to guess, and again, I don't want to speak for the author who is more than capable of doing this herself. I suspect that that's a big part of it. I mean, I think that by necessity with a novel like this, you're going to pick your battles in terms of intent and in terms of desired effect on the reader. Because, so for example, I'm an Arab writer, but I write in English, and I know a lot of Arab writers who do the same. And there's a spectrum of, for lack of a better word, accessibility. And we're all on different points of the spectrum. So what I mean by that is, I know certain writers who, when they write about Arabness in any way, will hold the reader's hand throughout. So every single Arabic word is going to be written in italics and then immediately followed by an explanation of what it is. Inshallah, I said, meaning God willing. And then there's folks like me who are on the other end of the spectrum, which is, I'm not going to hold your hand. And if you miss the reference, you miss it, but I'm going to present it in this particular way. I'm not saying any one of those approaches is correct or incorrect, but there's a spectrum of approaches of how much am I going to hold the reader's hand and walk them through this. And I think if you're working backwards from the desired effect of getting people to care about a vulnerable population, one of the approaches is, I'm not losing anyone on this journey. I'm going to make sure that I hit every beat emotionally and narratively so that I get to the desired effect where someone puts this book down and they are more empathetic towards a particular plight than they were when they opened it. All of that is very admirable, but it does have the side effect of turning the book into a kind of mission statement, a walking mission statement. And so all my favorite parts of this novel are the parts where I felt like the author was ready to let me slip a little bit, was ready to let me have like an uncertain interpretation of what's happening. I keep going back to that image of the keys hanging on the trees or something like that, right? All my least favorite parts of the book were the parts where it was clear that I was being led to a particular emotional conclusion so that I would feel a certain way and have a certain level of empathy change or something like that. So I suspect that was her intent. I suspect there's a big part of that, not in least because in the paperback, there's a whole Q&A about this sort of thing, right? About what do you want the readers to get out of it? It comes with pros and cons, and you can sort of see both of them in the novel.
If I can add to Omar, I think maybe now I'm thinking about it again, maybe that was the reason why the focus mainly was on them as a refugee. We didn't hear, I wasn't able to get a sense of who was attacking them in Aleppo. There was no mention that they were in an area bombed by the regime. The army was mentioned, but which army, I didn't get it. So I felt the kind of abstract or like stepping aside from mentioning Assad regime. She only mentioned ISIS when they were questioning them in Croydon, but avoiding mentioning the regime, it was a kind of, not to making anything controversial, for the pro-regime people in the West to be liking this product despite the fact that they are pro-regime. And I think one of my main issues is dealing with any crisis from such a perspective that it's a humanitarian crisis. It's not an earthquake. It's a war and there are sides in it. If you want to mention one of them, you're like ethically, you're supposed to be mentioning the others. So I think I agree with what Omar mentioned. I think that might be one of the extra elements, avoiding to mention the perpetrator is to gain and to lead the people to just feel sorry or passionate or empathized with the refugees as refugees of a crisis, regardless of who is causing that crisis or who established it.
I must say, speaking only for myself, whether it was fiction or whether you, Zaina, had written a report detailing these same kinds of treatments, I learned a lot from this novel about the inhumanity that refugees, whether they're from Syria, whether they're from Afghanistan, whether they're from China, wherever, the plight of the refugee. And we're seeing it not only because of battles and changes of regimes, we're seeing it because of earthquakes and mudslides. And look at Haiti and the people trying to leave from there and the kinds of experiences they are having. I felt enlightened by this book because, as I said earlier, I've certainly read the newspapers, I've seen the photographs, but this book took me more deeply into the experiences, fictional though they may be, of the refugee. We have one comment here. Person says, to me, the book is beautifully written and emotionally persuasive. Isn't that enough? Bethanne?
Yes, I definitely have something to say to this because I do think it's emotionally persuasive. I think the storytelling is very, very good. The story arc, the way she tells it. One thing I want us all to remember, it's not just, who is us or the Western lens. Nouri and Afra also have enough money to get from Syria to England. So we are not just seeing any old refugees on a journey. We are seeing refugees who, as I said at the beginning, may not be upper class, but for whatever reason, because they were good business people, because they were good savers, because there was money from relatives, we don't know precisely, they do have resources to get from one place to another. And I am not saying that to criticize Lefteri. I am saying that so that we all realize when we see a refugee who has gotten to the West, it is not always a person who was, their journey may be desperate, but they had something. And that makes me think of all the people who couldn't make the journey. And that really hit hard for me when I finished the book. I thought, I'm glad that Mustafa and his family, for example, are happy in the north of England and doing so well. But what about the people who didn't have the money to get the ID documents and make the passage? That's something that really hit hard, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally.
Here is another question from a viewer who says, I was stunned that Nuri did not murder the man who raped his wife, but would help to kill a man who supported the sexual abuse of boys. I recognize he wanted to get to England, but this seemed inconsistent. Your thoughts, Zaina?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add about this, frankly, but I wanted to follow up on the points raised before. I think I was thinking at the end of it, maybe if it was translated by a right-wing hating refugees members, it will be a great thing to be published in Arabic to tell the people, do not take this journey because this is what would happen. Your wives are going to be raped and you're going to be seeing your kids being raped in the camps. So I was thinking about it in a different way. If it is translated in Arabic and being distributed on those platforms where refugees are seeking information from, it will be a great tool for the right wing to push refugees away.
What about you, Omar, about the man who raped Nuri's wife and the other man who helped procure those twin boys in the camp?
My suspicion, again, and this is a very uncharitable but way of thinking about it, is that that plot twist, that turn of being so desperate to get to the place that you are willing to acquiesce to a horrific thing, I suspect was the overriding principle that sort of allowed this particular narrative turn to happen, would be my suspicion. I mean, I'm thinking back to something Bethanne said about this idea of, well, this couple could afford it, or sort of like, what about the others? And that's fascinating to me as a thing to think about, because, and this has less to do with the book, more the environment in which this book comes out of, the publishing environment. If a book comes out tomorrow in America about a middle-aged New England couple going through the ennui of a failing marriage, and that book is not particularly good, well, good news, there's 10 other books that are dealing with that subject matter and will address it from all facets and aspects. I can't say the same about books dealing with this subject matter in the West. I think that, and again, this is very cynical on my part, I think there's a lot of gatekeepers within the industry who will say, why do we need a second Syria book? We already have this one Syria book over here, right? And so what that does is create, this thing I call Atlas syndrome, where you're aware of this as a writer, and suddenly you feel like you have to carry the entire planet of the identity group that you're writing about over, which other people don't feel, right? You can write about this particular sliver of an experience, knowing full well you're not carrying the whole thing in, and yours is going to be the one book that has to do all of the work, right? So I see where you're coming from, Bethanne, with this idea of there are other experiences beyond this particular niche.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
just a matter
but it's
of
hard to get it published.
Or expecting one book to cover the gamut of it, right?
That's right.
That's an unfair expectation from the get-go, regardless of what you think of this particular book. But that's a systemic thing.
Yeah.
And again, I can't put that entirely on the author.
No, and that's exactly, oh, sorry, Diane.
Go ahead, Bethanne, finish.
I was just going to say, that's what, it didn't come to me until the end. And I thought, I can't blame Lefteri for that. I'm not blaming her for not writing about, the man with nothing to his name who wasn't able to leave. It was something that really hit me. And that is, back to Diane's point, one of the reasons I think so many people have read this book, because it is the book about Syria that has made it through. And it is the book about Syria that is accessible to so many American readers. That doesn't make everything that we've been talking about wrong. It just means I'm glad there's something. I'm glad there's something. It's imperfect. We need more, we need different, but I would prefer a world with the Beekeeper of Aleppo rather than without. But that may not be what Zaina and Omar feel.
Here's a question for you, Zaina. What countries did most Syrian refugees end up in? Which countries in the world were most welcoming to those refugees?
That's the second part is pretty much hard, because even like defining welcoming for us, it's pretty much different. Like welcoming, they didn't kill us, they didn't push us away. That's welcoming for us. The first question, like despite the general consensus that all or most of the refugees are actually in the West, the vast majority are still in the neighboring countries, not to mention those who are displaced within Syria. So in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, there is more than 50% of the Syrian refugees around the globe. And then I'm not sure, I haven't updated my information, but I think in terms of Europe, Germany is the country that hosts the most of the Syrians. In terms of welcoming, from my personal experience, I think the most welcoming communities were those who have such an experience in being refugee themselves recently, the kind of generations. So I felt, for example, when London is pretty much cosmetic, but when I went to Scotland, I was kind of in North Ireland, I was able to sense more passion. And I think also there were Jewish communities who literally did a lot to help the refugees and to advocate for them, because they still have this burden of being on a boat and being pushed away. But this is pretty much unscientific notification, observation.
And what about Angela Merkel's the pushback she got taking in those refugees? So it certainly affected, to one degree or another, the countries that did take refugees in, Bethanne.
Absolutely. And this is, it's the pushback is very interesting to me, because I know Germany has taken in many refugees, but I actually lived in Berlin some years back for 4 years. And one of the things I know about Berlin is it is a city of division, conflict, and paradox. And that pretty much describes Germany's policies as well. And I fear for Europe's near past acceptance of refugees with the far right movements that are gaining strength in Europe. And I don't want to get too political, and I also don't have tons of information, but just from my experience on the ground in Germany and my experience in what I've read in the past few years, I remain hopeful, but I don't know. I think there would be other places I'd want to go.
But that takes me to the next question, that is Mustafa's comment after the death of his son. Cause of death, this broken world. And the question our viewer puts forth is, have we become stunned by the plight of the refugees in many parts of the world, Myanmar, Africa, Afghanistan? How can we wake up and respond? Would Lefteri have been wiser to write a nonfiction account of the problems facing refugees, Omar?
I just say that line infuriated me. almost more than anything else in the book. That line where he writes "cause of death" and broken. I don't. That's just purely on a personal level. There's something about it where I was really, that's what he wrote. So these questions are really interesting to me. The person who asked, isn't that enough? And the sort of tactical question about whether it would have been a better approach to write nonfiction. I mean, I think one of the, again, this is an overgeneralization, but I think one of the central privileges of living in the West is the privilege of instantaneous forgetting, which is to say that it is good enough to be outraged about a particular crisis or calamity or tragedy or injustice for a short duration, and then move on and be outraged about the next thing, and move on and move on and move on, knowing that there's very little consequence to moving on. And so I think, my personal view is that what fiction does, it does very covertly. When I pick up a piece of nonfiction, I get the information from it.
Right.
And I absorb that information. Now I have it as part of my tool set. When I read fiction, the thing it is doing to me, the way in which it is changing me is much more subtle. It took me years to understand what Song of Solomon was teaching me about the power of names and the agency associated with the names you're given versus the names you give yourself, and so on and so forth. It's not a direct link between cause and effect with fiction. And so from a purely pragmatic sense, I'm sure if this author had written a nonfiction account, there would be lots of statistics and that sort of thing,
right,
that would burnish it. But I think if you're going to go into fiction, you have to commit to the idea that you might cause very subtle and slow moving change that nobody can kind of put their finger on directly. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing fiction can do. It's just a very dangerous thing because you can't always tell what effect you're having.
Zaina, any comment?
When Omar was speaking, I was thinking about this particular argument. That's not just for a book or for a film, but generally, especially those who are still trapped, living this conflict, that people are actually getting themselves famous and getting themselves rich from writing or from the misery of their lives. I know what Omar is speaking about fiction and the stories that lives, but I can't really discredit this idea that like mentioning the name, if it wasn't a particular incident, particular name, and Aleppo and the city, I would have understood it's fiction, it's done. But mentioning the name and the context and making it all Syrian without having even the persons who was translating or who was helping out in, you have this sense that it might be, or they have the right to feel, some Syrians have the right to feel that their stories are being exposed for films or books or whatever form, and it's not back to them in any way. And that's why maybe I focused on facts. It's not to make it a factual investigative piece, but because this is a piece that has been done with specifically naming such neighbors and such people. So I felt it must have those elements because it is mainly being built and got its famously from such a, it is in the title. So that was my idea, but certainly it's different from any journalistic piece, and I understand that.
That is so powerful, Zaina, and something that is going to really stay with me as a critic, because if it were the beekeeper from the countryside or the beekeeper from even, I don't know, Cyprus, or the beekeeper's journey or something like that, it wouldn't seem quite so I can't think of the word right now, but it wouldn't seem like it was taking so much from the culture. So I that's a great thought. It doesn't mean, of course, that this book shouldn't have been written. It doesn't mean, anything, but I think it's such a great thing to have that thought and consider it. Thank you.
Well, I must say, it does seem to me that a great many of us perhaps have learned something about this book, about what's happened in Syria. But Zaina, can you elucidate us into a brief reality of what has happened with the Syrian refugees?
Well, first, I need to address my privileges because I didn't hit the sea. I was privileged enough to have visa. I was privileged enough to speak English and work for international organization. So this would make me really concerned. Like even as a Syrian who lived all her life in Syria, when I speak about Syrian refugees, I need to address those privileges. That's why I can't accept any Westerner starting to speak about it. And when asked, they would say, I volunteered for 2 weeks or whatever. So what's the situation now? I've never been in a camp. I don't know, but I know that the doors are being closed, and especially in the nice country that I'm living at. I know that I'm even struggling to get my mother a visa to visit, although I am not on benefits. I pay my taxes, and like I live here, I own a house. Everything is much more difficult than the stage where the book was written, and it's getting much more difficult every year. Even crossing from Syria to Turkey now, you need to pay $4,000, and it's not 100% guaranteed. Crossing to Lebanon is a death sentence, and the crossing to Jordan is completely closed. So the hundreds of families who are stuck inside Syria and they don't have any way around. And only this morning, one of the camps, and it's called the Widows Camp, was actually bombed by Russian forces. And it stunned me that they actually called the camp the Widows Camp, Omar El Akkad. So this is the situations for those who are stuck, who are not privileged enough to make it to a novel or to make it to where I am now.
Finally, Bethanne, would you recommend this book to your friends, your neighbors? How do you feel?
That is a really good question. And I absolutely would at this point. I absolutely would. And I would, because it would be my friends and neighbors, give them some of this feedback, give them some of these things we talked about. I would have told them, for instance, before we spoke today, I would have said, this book is not the strongest writing, and I have some problems with this character and that character, but I will be recommending it. And I do think that it is an incredibly moving book in some ways.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining this discussion today. Special thanks to Zaina Erhaim, Omar El Akkad, and Bethanne Patrick. Before you go, please take a moment to fill out our short survey about this event that's going to pop up on the screen. And if you would consider donating to WAMU, your financial support is what makes it possible for us to bring you events like this one. Go to dianerehm.org/give. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, November 17th. We'll discuss Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, a 2021 National Book Award finalist, and the interview that will follow will be with Mr. Doerr himself. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody, and Rashad Young is our engineer today. Yanlin Zhang is our events coordinator. We couldn't do this event without the support of Berendra Silva, Julia Slattery, April Stevens, Lynn Kronberger, Brian Colombo, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thank you to all of these people and to all of you, and most especially to our guest today. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Bye-bye.